The first thing I noticed when I pulled into my parents' driveway that evening was the smell of fresh paint. Not the inside kind, the kind that signals nesting and renewal. The outside kind, the kind people use when they want a house to look like nothing is wrong. I had driven 4 hours from Cincinnati for Thanksgiving, which was already a compromise. The previous visit had ended with my mother telling my aunt, loudly enough to carry through the kitchen wall, that she sometimes wondered whether adopting would have been simpler. That was 8 months ago. I had not been back since. But I came anyway, because I was still operating under the assumption that presence was a form of healing. I should have read the paint more carefully. Dinner itself went the way dinners in that house had always gone. My father held court. My younger sister Bridget orbited him, laughing at the right moments, agreeing with precision. My Aunt Rosalind, who had never once in her life said a kind thing that wasn't also a trap, watched me the way she always did, like she was calculating something. I ate carefully, spoke carefully, took up careful space. And then my mother, who had been refilling wine glasses for 90 minutes, set down the bottle and said, without preamble, that she and my father had decided to convert my old bedroom into a home office, which meant the storage boxes in the closet needed to go. She had already started on them, she said. Most of it was clutter. I asked what she had kept. She looked at Rosalind. Rosalind looked at her coffee cup. I went upstairs. The closet was empty. 3 boxes of childhood records, school projects, the folder of letters my grandmother had written me during the years she lived in Portugal, the leather journal I had kept from age 12 to 15, all of it gone. Not relocated to another room. Not stacked in the garage. My mother, when I came back downstairs, said she had brought 2 bags to the donation center that afternoon. Then she shrugged in a way that suggested the subject was closed and asked Bridget to pass the sweet potatoes. Rosalind said, "You always did hold on to things too long, Mara." Bridget laughed. My father didn't look up from his plate. I did not raise my voice. I said goodnight, gathered my overnight bag from the guest room, and walked to my car in the dark. They probably assumed I was being dramatic, performing hurt to force an apology that would never come anyway. What they could not have known was that I had taken something with me before I left. Not dramatically, not consciously at first. I had slipped 3 items from my mother's desk into my bag while retrieving my jacket from the hallway closet, a manila folder, a USB drive, and a small black notebook with my father's initials embossed on the cover. They had been sitting on top of a stack of papers beside her keyboard, papers I had glanced at long enough to recognize what they were. I am a healthcare compliance auditor. I work primarily with nonprofit hospitals and their donor accounts. What I do professionally is trace money. I find where it went, confirm it went where it was supposed to, and document the difference when it didn't. I pulled onto the highway with the folder in my passenger seat and drove the first hour without music. My grandmother Eleanor had died 14 months earlier. She had not been wealthy by most measures, but she had been careful, the kind of careful that comes from surviving scarcity in childhood. When I was in my mid-20s, she had called me specifically, not my parents, not Bridget, to ask whether I could help her organize the charitable trust she wanted to establish in her final years. A modest endowment meant to fund literacy programming at 2 rural libraries she had loved. She chose me because I understood compliance structures. She had told me so directly in that way she had of saying plain-spoken things without embarrassment. I had helped her establish the account, set up the disbursement schedule, and agreed to serve as secondary oversight trustee, a role that required no action, unless the primary trustee, my father, failed to file the annual charitable distributions on time. He had not filed them. Not once since her death. The folder I had taken from my mother's desk contained 3 years of unfiled disbursement notices, 2 IRS inquiry letters, and a wire transfer summary showing that a portion of the trust's principal had been moved to a private account I did not recognize and had not authorized. The USB drive contained a financial planning document my father had prepared for the house sale he and my mother had been quietly arranging for the past 6 months. The notebook contained handwritten notes about the sale timeline and a line I read at a red light 40 miles outside the city that I will not quote verbatim, but which made clear that both my parents understood the trust funds were not theirs to use and had proceeded anyway. I want to be precise about what happened next, because this is where people tend to read the story wrong. I was not angry in the way people expect. I was not shaking, was not crying, was not rehearsing confrontations in the rearview mirror. I was very, very quiet. The specific kind of quiet that settles over a person when they finally understand the full shape of something they have been standing too close to see clearly. I spent the following week documenting everything. I pulled the trust account records through the compliance portal, where I had oversight access. I cross-referenced the wire transfer dates against my father's notebook entries. I consulted, carefully and hypothetically, with a colleague who specialized in fiduciary misconduct to understand what the exposure looked like. I built a folder so structured and sourced that it could have been handed to a regulator without a single revision. On Thursday, my phone rang. It was Bridget, which was unusual. She and I had never been close in the way people imagine sisters are close. We had shared a house and a last name, and that was mostly the extent of it. She worked in real estate and carried herself the way people do when they have decided that charm is a professional skill. "Mom says you left without saying goodbye," she said, as though that were the news. "Mom threw away Grandma Eleanor's letters," I said. A pause. "She said they were taking up space. What does Dad need the trust account for?" Another pause, longer. "What do you mean? There have been no charitable disbursements filed since Grandma died," I said. "I have the IRS correspondence. I also have the transfer records." "So what does he need it for?" She told me I was misreading things. I told her I was a compliance auditor and that misreading financial documentation was not, professionally speaking, something I did often. She told me I was always looking for reasons to make things difficult. I told her I was looking at wire transfer records from March, June, and September, totaling more than $40,000 moved to an account not named in the trust instrument. The line went quiet in a different way after that. "Meet me Saturday," she said finally. "Just coffee. Don't do anything before Saturday." We met at a place near her office. A cafe with too many exposed surfaces and too little noise insulation. She arrived looking composed in the way people look when composure is taking effort. She did not sit before she started. "Dad needs the house sale to clear," she said. "There's a buyer. It closes in 6 weeks. If the trust issue surfaces before then, the whole thing unravels." "The trust issue," I repeated. "Don't be precise at me right now, Bridget." "He moved donor money. Charitable donor money that Grandma Eleanor designated for library programs." She pressed both hands flat on the table. "He intended to replace it. That's what people say when they haven't replaced it." She rubbed the side of her face. "What do you want?" I had been asking myself that since Thursday night. I was not interested in theater. I was not interested in scenes. What I wanted was specific and, I thought, reasonable. The disbursements had to be filed, the missing funds restored to the trust before the house closed, and the 2 libraries had to receive what Eleanor had intended. Beyond that, I wanted my parents to stop constructing a narrative in which I was the unstable daughter. "Can you agree to those terms?" I asked. She looked at the table. "I can try." That's not the same thing. By Sunday, the family group text had become active in the way it only became active when someone was trying to shape a story before it could be told by someone else. My Aunt Rosalind posted something extended and fragrant about the sacrifices parents make, and the ingratitude of children who only see what they want to see. My mother added a response that described herself as heartbroken without specifying why, which was, Bridget had apparently shared enough to create alarm but not enough to create accountability. I understood what they were doing. I had grown up watching them do it. Monday evening, my father called. He spoke in his formal voice, the one he used when he wanted to sound like the reasonable party in a room. "You took documents from this house," he said. "I took documents that implicated fiduciary misconduct from a desk where they were sitting in plain view," I said. "You can argue about my methods with the IRS when they ask why neither of us has that problem with the documents themselves." Silence. "What do you want?" he asked. It was the same question Bridget had asked, in the same tone, which told me they had compared notes and arrived at the same strategy: treat this as a negotiation. "I want Eleanor's trust honored," I said. I want the disbursements filed and the missing funds restored. I want no version of this story circulated in which I am the villain. And I want the letters Mom threw away acknowledged as what they were. He told me I was being unreasonable. I told him I had the USB drive, the notebook, and the wire transfer summary, and that I also had a professional obligation as a named trustee to report material irregularities to the State Attorney General's Charitable Trust Division, an obligation I had so far exercised discretion in not fulfilling. He told me I wouldn't do that to my own family. I told him I already had the form pulled up. He hung up. The calls began arriving at 11:40 that night. My father. My mother. Rosalind, which surprised me slightly. Bridget, who had apparently been crying for some time before she dialed. I did not answer any of them. I sat at my kitchen table with the documentation spread in careful stacks and listened to voicemails stack up like weather. At 1:17 in the morning, the pounding started. 4 of them, it turned out, my parents, Rosalind, and Bridget. I looked through the peephole before I said anything. My father had both palms against the doorframe. My mother's eye makeup had tracked down her face in 2 parallel lines. Rosalind was clutching her coat closed like the hallway was judging her. Bridget stood slightly apart from the group with both hands over her mouth. I opened the door on the chain. We were wrong, my mother said immediately. Her voice cracked on the second word. About the letters, about everything, Mara, please. You are standing outside my apartment at 1 in the morning, I said, because the house sale falls apart if I file the report, because we are your family, my father said. So were the people Grandma Eleanor gave her money to honor. He looked like he wanted to say something that required a different version of this situation. What do you need us to do? Bridget asked. She was not performing. That was the difference. She had been crying, genuinely, and it had stripped the real estate voice entirely. I told them through the door gap. Every word of it, the same terms I had given my father on the phone, stated now in front of witnesses. The trust restored before closing. The disbursements filed by end of week. A written acknowledgement to the family, not private, not buried, that I had not sabotaged anything, that I had done what a trustee is legally required to do, and that the version of events Rosalind had been circulating was false. Rosalind started to object. I told her she could object or she could go home, but the terms did not change. My mother said, "If we do all of this, will you come back?" I looked at her through the 2-inch gap in the door for a long moment. Come back to what? I asked. The version where I absorb everything and call it love? She didn't answer. The terms stand, I said. The decision of what comes after that is separate. They stood in the hallway for another few minutes, rearranging themselves around a silence that didn't offer any cover. Then my father nodded. Once, the kind of nod that a man gives when he has run out of alternatives and is grading himself on accepting that gracefully. They left at 2:24 in the morning. I sat with the documentation until dawn, not reviewing it, just sitting with it, the way you sit with something after the hardest part is over. The disbursements were filed by Friday. The funds were restored from the house sale proceeds 2 weeks before closing. Bridget sent me a message that said only, "The libraries have been notified." I read it 3 times before I replied. The closing happened. My parents sold the house for less than they had hoped, after the buyer's attorney flagged the trust irregularities during due diligence and renegotiated accordingly. My father has not called since. My mother sent a card at Christmas with a note that was 3 sentences of careful edited language that told me she had rewritten it several times. Rosalind has not been in contact, which I understand is her version of acknowledgement. Bridget and I have spoken 4 times since that night. Carefully at first, then less carefully. Something is being built there, slowly, the way you build things after the original structure has been properly demolished. I kept 1 letter. A single page my grandmother had written me the December before she died, which I had fortunately scanned. I had it printed on good paper and framed it myself. It sits on my desk beside my monitor. Every morning I read the last line, which I won't reproduce here because it belongs to her, and to me, and then I open my work. There is a version of this story that ends with reconciliation, everyone around a table. The hard year softened by enough time and shared meals. I am not opposed to that version existing eventually. What I am opposed to is pretending it has arrived before it has. Some people understand your importance only after access to you becomes conditional. That is not a character flaw in you. It is information. So I want to ask you something honestly. If the people who claim to love you most had spent years treating your loyalty as infrastructure, something load-bearing and invisible and never acknowledged, would you have walked to that door? And what do you think it costs a person to finally stop answering it?